Hello, students. Today is Sunday afternoon, August 27th, and I am making this video to cover in this format the things that we covered in class over this last week. So far this year, we've moved through quite a bit of material in Greek philosophy. We spent 3 weeks with our first Greek philosopher, Plato. We've spent 3 weeks on Aristotle, and we're about to jump 1,500 years in time to land next week with medieval European philosopher Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas is a fascinating figure, not because his prose is particularly interesting, but because of his ideas, and because of the importance that he has for the general development of Western philosophy. But today I want to use this video to sort of fill in the gaps. There's a lot that happens during those 1,500 years, and I want to begin today by going over one of those major turning points. The major turning point that I want to review in this video is the relationship Christianity has to Western philosophy as a whole. As you remember in class, we've gone over several key dates for Christianity, and I want to rehearse those with you for just a moment. 300 years after Aristotle had finished developing his philosophical system, a major shift occurred in the Western world, and that, of course, is the beginning of the new religion, Christianity. Christianity begins chronologically with the birth of Jesus in 4 BC, his crucifixion in 29 AD, and, as his followers tell, his resurrection that same year. What's so earth-shattering and surprising about that development is that Christianity, over the next 2 centuries, really overturns everything that had come before it. Greco-Roman paganism had been the universal religion of the Mediterranean world. Everybody held to some version of the Olympian gods, and really the Greek religion was very, maybe we could say flexible is a good word for it, in that really any tribe, any nation's gods could be called simply a version of those original Greek gods. Well, all of a sudden, there is a new religion, that's Christianity, and it spreads throughout all the major Roman cities. The Roman cities are connected through a network of trading, through roadways, and through the Roman military, and this new religion spreads seemingly overnight. All of a sudden, there are groups of people who say they follow some obscure carpenter from the province of Judea, who, contrary to the official record, is not actually dead. This is pretty surprising to an awful lot of Roman officials, and they can't seem to stop it. Between the years 30 to 100 AD, the Christian religion spreads throughout the Roman Empire. But so much so that by the time we get to the year 312 AD, as he is trying to solidify his rule over the western half of the empire, Roman Emperor Constantine proclaims his imperial victory over his opponent Maxentius in the name of the Christian cross. He uses the cross as a talisman to conquer in. The story goes that he received a vision, and then he awoke and he commanded all of his troops to conquer in the sign of the cross. Well, from that point on, Constantine was connected with Christianity, and by the time on his deathbed, later in the 4th century, he was baptized, becoming the first Roman Christian emperor. Well, by the year 381 AD, Emperor Theodosius proclaimed Christianity to be the official empire of the religion of the Roman Empire. Rome is no longer a pagan place. Now it is a Christian empire, and Christian membership and belief became mandatory for all those who wanted to participate in the Roman civil order. Well, all of a sudden, then, Christianity becomes a huge part of what it means to be Roman, and over the following millennia, what it means to be European. And as this thing called Europe comes into existence, it becomes inextricably tied to Christianity. As Europe then, in the following centuries, spreads its power and influence around the world, so too does Christianity. So the course of Western civilization goes hand in hand with the spread of Christianity. I want to be clear, those are 2 different things. Western civilization is one thing and Christianity is something else, but they often work together. Sometimes they butt heads, sometimes they're partners, but they go hand in hand and they influence each other through the interactions. So for us to kind of follow the understanding of Western philosophy and how it grows and changes, we have to consider what exactly are the philosophical implications of this thing called Christianity. Well, so In order to consider this, and I want to be clear, Thales Academy is not a religious school. We're not affirming necessarily these convictions, but the reason we're going over this as a philosophy class is because several of our major philosophers hold to these essential Christian teachings. And they assume when they write their philosophy that we are reading that we know these convictions. They also assume that we share those convictions in some cases, like Aquinas, but for us to approach them, we have to do our homework and know these assumptions going in. Well, understanding the philosophical implications of Christianity is going to take us first back to early church father Tertullian. Tertullian was a great writer. He had a lot of clever one-liners. Today, he would have been a guy tweeting like mad, and he would have had that zippy phrase that would all of a sudden have gone viral across the internet, perhaps in a day or two. One of those phrases that he had that is included in one of his early books is this quotation: "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" It's a question. Well, for Tertullian, it was a very live question because before becoming a Christian, Tertullian had been thoroughly educated in the Paideia, or the Greek system of education of his day. He was one of the top educated people, and he used his education in his ministry and his writing. He was not alone in that. Many of the Christian leaders, the priests and the bishops, were all educated under the system of thought that came to be called Greek rhetoric. Well, so it became a very real and pressing question for these guys who had these profound religious experiences to figure out, how does my newfound Christian faith on the one hand relate to these established Greco-Roman educational principles and stories on the other? When one is based on a divinely revealed truth that is conveyed through a living tradition and a written down word called the Bible, and the other is a collection of probably false myths and definitely outrageous claims connected to a whole bunch of gods that we don't believe in anymore, how do those two things relate to each other? For Tertullian, this question is very real, and he wonders about the possibility, does being a Christian mean that you cannot participate in the normal society of the day? Does being a Christian mean you can't be part of the military? Because as a member of the military, you might have to make sacrifices to the gods. Does being a Christian mean you can't be a teacher in a typical Roman city, where you would have to teach Homer and Virgil and these poets who clearly don't believe in Yahweh, the one God, and his Son, Jesus the Christ, and the Holy Spirit, who all together are the triune God, this three-in-one logical paradox of a deity? Well, if that's the case, then Christians have no real part of the normal society of their day. Well, Tertullian raises this question. It doesn't really get answered very thoroughly until St. Augustine. Several people imply that, of course, these two things are not mutually exclusive. But we'll get to Augustine here in just a moment. I want to use Tertullian to raise the very real question, because this is a philosophical question. Are Christianity and Greco-Roman knowledge mutually exclusive? Or are they partners? Can they work together? Do they complement each other in some way? Or are they essentially like oil and water? Well, for the last 2,000 years, Christian thinkers have been asking these sorts of questions about the relationship between Christian faith and the normal society that Christians always find themselves in. Christians are almost never the dominant group, and they have moral and philosophical claims that go against what the mainstream society says. Well, can Christians use the tools and approaches of philosophy to strengthen their faith? Or does their faith mean that Christians should never appeal to the claims and methods of philosophy? For the last 2,000 years, Christians have predominantly said, we can use the tools of philosophy to express our faith claims in intellectually rigorous ways. Lots of intellectuals who uphold to the Christian faith believe that it is vital that they must be able to articulate their convictions in the most rigorous, academic, philosophically sound ways. And they believe that doing so actually shows that their faith is true. After all, if things are true, then they're going to stand up to intellectual testing. And if something won't stand up to an intellectual test, if it's defeated in a philosophical debate, if it's proven to be false, well then, no Christian should believe it anyway. One early example of this is the Roman philosopher who goes by the name of Justin Martyr. A contemporary Protestant who does this is a man named Russell Moore. One famous Roman Catholic who has done this very well is a Roman Catholic philosopher named Alistair MacIntyre. So I raise those names simply to make the point that there is a very significant part of practicing Christianity that involves trying to articulate the Christian faith in a philosophically robust way. So, in the remainder of this video lecture, I want to do two things. First, I do want to go over the philosophical framework of Christianity I think is nestled inside the New Testament. That's not what the New Testament is intentionally trying to do, but in making the claims of a religion, it is giving answers to the profound questions of philosophy we've been tossing around these recent weeks. Secondly, I want to give you an example of that philosophy put into practice in the person of Augustine, Bishop of Hippo. So with that, I want to quickly go over a Christian framework of philosophy from the New Testament. And if you have your iPads handy, you may want to open the ESV Bible app and take note of these passages as I read them and comment on them. There are 5 points I want to go over. I'm just going to list those for you here briefly. First, I want to go over what is called a Christian cosmology. Secondly, a Christian epistemology. Third, a Christian teleology, and by implication, an axiology. Fourth, a Christian anthropology. And finally, the Christian view of eternity. The 5 of these things are buried inside various letters and gospels and writings of the New Testament, all of which form a Christian view of reality. Let's begin with Christian epistemology. If you want to tab over in your app to Paul's letter to the city of Colossae, as I'm turning there, we're going to look at Paul's letter to the Colossians to see a Christian cosmology. Now, a cosmology is an attempt to explain the very nature of the cosmos. The Greeks, of course, have a cosmology. They believe that all that exists is ordered by Zeus and maintained by him. For Christians, they're going to look at something different to explain all that exists. And that primarily for Christianity is going to be directly related to the person of Christ. You'll remember that the Christian idea of God is an invisible, all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing, supreme being who creates mankind out of love and out of a desire for relationship. Not because he himself doesn't have a relationship. The Christian God is a triune being in relationship with himself, but he desires that others know and be known. Well, as part of that, the Apostle Paul, in trying to explain all that exists, appeals to the facts of the incarnation, where God becomes man in the person of Jesus Christ as a way of helping us understand ultimate reality. I'm reading from Paul's letter to the church in Colossae, beginning in chapter 1, verse 15. He here refers to Jesus. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For everything was created by him, in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and by him all things hold together. He is also the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile everything to himself, by making peace through the blood of his cross, whether things on earth or things in heaven. Once you were alienated and hostile in your minds because of evil actions, but now he has reconciled you by his physical presence, by his physical body through his death, to present you holy and faultless and blameless before him. If indeed you remain grounded and steadfast in the faith, and are not shifted away from the hope of the gospel that you heard. This gospel has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and I, Paul, have become a servant of it. The Apostle Paul does a lot in this short passage, but here primarily he establishes the idea that everything that is created was created by God through the person of Jesus Christ. So by knowing Jesus, Christians believe they literally know the very force, the very person who authored the entirety of reality. In him, all things live and move and have their being. So Jesus, then, for Christians, is the ultimate ground of reality. This is the beginning of a Christian cosmology. We also see in this passage a description of what the work of Jesus actually is, where Jesus, through his work on earth, through his death and resurrection, reconciles both man and God, and man with man, and creation itself to God. Christianity proclaims the idea that things are not as they should be, but through the work of Jesus Christ, we become what we were intended originally to be. So this then is where Christianity begins, with considering the very nature of reality. All that exists was created by God, and all that exists is impacted by the death and resurrection of Jesus, the Christ. Well, turn back, or if you're in a physical copy of the Bible, or tap over if you're in an app, to the Gospel of John, and we're next going to consider the very opening of the Gospel of John. Where here, we learn something very unique about the claims of Christianity in relation to epistemology, the philosophy of knowledge. Now, you'll remember from our study of Plato and Aristotle that the Greeks believe reason is supreme. Aristotle defines man as the rational animal. Through reason, we can come to understand everything. Plato doesn't quite look at reason that same way. He sees memory as the key to ultimate understanding, because we contain all knowledge. Well, Christianity offers us a different explanation of knowledge. Instead of having the capacity to understand all things, or the ability to remember truth that we simply have forgotten, Christianity says the mind is naturally dark and unable to actually perceive the truth. We don't actually want to know the real things. But then something changed with Christ entering into creation. He is the light and the word that brings with him the ability to all of a sudden understand things much more fully than we can on our own. I'm reading from the Gospel according to St. John, chapter 1, verses 1 through 14. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through him, and apart from him, not one thing was created. Life that has been created. Life was in him, and that life was the light of men. That light shines in the darkness, yet the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man named John, who was sent from God. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. The true light, who gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was created through him, yet the world did not recognize him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, he gave the right to be called children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. The Word became flesh and took up residence among us. We observed his glory, the glory as the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, this passage contains a rich description of the person of Christ and his work. For our purposes in terms of knowledge, I want to just point out that ultimate reality entered into the physical, normal world, according to this passage. The Word who created all things entered into his creation, and people did not recognize him. That's the claim that's made here, that we human beings, on our own, actually don't have all ability to reason correctly. We would not recognize truth with a capital T if it stood right in front of us on our own. That's the claim of Christianity, that Christians actually are given a new capacity to recognize truth that other people simply do not have. We'll see a little bit more on that here in a few moments. But turn over in John's Gospel to John chapter 14, and we're going to look at verse 6. This is one of the most famous passages in the Gospel of John. It's also one of the most confusing, so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it, but make some simple commentary on it. In John chapter 6, in John chapter 14, verse 6, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Two things I want to point out here. First, please do note the exclusivity of the claim. There are plenty of people who would like to make the argument that Christianity, like all religions, tells a way to get to God. This verse shows that that is simply not the case. Christianity claims to be the way to get to God. As you'll remember from last year's logic class, that is a universal affirmation type sentence. That's an A sentence. That is not one of many. That is not one of some. That is the only way. That's an exclusive claim, which means it's either right or wrong, true or false. Could be either of those, but it doesn't leave a whole lot of wiggle room. Secondly, and more importantly for this particular topic and Christian epistemology, we have a fascinatingly unique definition of truth. Jesus does not get into deep philosophical conversation here about what is truth. He doesn't debate it. He doesn't set up a Socratic dialogue about truth. Instead, he tells us that he is the truth. And correspondingly then, truth changes in our conception. If that statement is correct, then truth is a relationship. Truth is that which corresponds to ultimate reality. Truth then, according to what we just talked about in John chapter 6, truth is not necessarily perceivable by those who do not have a connection with Jesus. If Jesus is the ultimate reality and he gives those who follow him an ability to understand ultimate reality, then according to Christianity, truth is that which lines up with ultimate reality. And those who are not part of the Christian faith do not have the same capacity to understand truth. Now, as with usual with a philosophy class, I hope we've stressed enough. I've stressed by this point. I'm not asking you to agree with those claims. I simply want you to understand them. Well, let's move on then to Christian teleology and axiology. You'll remember we talked about teleology as a philosophy of purpose. Well, axiology is a philosophy of values. Everything that has a purpose is appealing to some sort of value to say why the end they're trying to achieve is important. So this teleology and axiology tend to go hand in hand. Turn over in your Bibles or on your app to the Gospel according to St. Matthew. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 through 40, where in this passage, Jesus is going to give the clearest statement of what is the absolutely important thing to do. It's an important question. He's here asked by someone in the crowd, "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment?" This might be something akin to asking a teacher, "What's the most important thing I have to do? If I'm only going to do 3 things in this class, what's number 1, number 2, and number 3?" Well, Jesus gives a very clear answer. I'm going to pick up reading in verse 37 in Matthew chapter 22. Jesus said to him, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and most important command. The second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets depend on these 2 commandments." This is a pivotal, incredibly significant passage for the Christian faith. This passage gives us an insight into the most important thing that Christianity says is vital for humanity. The first, of course, is the relationship with God, and that's a relationship of love that human beings owe to their Creator. You'll notice in this verse that Jesus identifies different facets of humanity. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, those are your emotions, all your mind, that's your mental thoughts and your ability, all your soul, that's going to be everything that makes you unique. The Gospel of Mark goes on to add a 4th quality, all of your strength, that includes your body and all of your physical deeds. Every part of the human person is called to love this God who created them, according to the Christian faith. Now, secondly, in this passage, Jesus then goes on to give us a direction that's going to be the heart of the Christian ethic, where here he says, love your neighbor as yourself. This is key to understanding Christianity and understanding ethics from within a Christian framework. When we talked about Aristotle, We talked about his virtue ethics, his aretaic ethics. The question was, what is the wise thing to do? What is the mean? What is the middle ground? And I'm going to stand firmly on the middle ground. I'm not going to go to an extreme to the right or to the left. I'm not going to be a coward, but I'm not going to be foolish either. I'm going to be courageous. That was Aristotle's idea of virtue. Plato told us we should look to the good, whatever the good is, and we should go all in on the good. But in both Plato and Aristotle's case, the reason why you should do that is to achieve personal excellence. For each of them, it's about the individual. It's about me. How do I be the best, most happiest, most fulfilled human being possible? Christianity goes in a very different direction. Here, we're told we must love our neighbors as ourselves. Now, loving yourself is important at some level. You have to love yourself to love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. But the impetus, the direction of Christian ethics is always going to be outward. It's going to be going towards others. It's not about me and how do I be the best person ever. Instead, it's about how do I serve other people? How do I love others? Possibly to an extreme. Because I'm trying to love other people as much as I love myself. Now, this is going to give Christianity a profoundly different tenor and different direction from anything that had come before it. Prior to Christianity, there was no massive social charity or welfare movement. There were no orphanages in ancient Rome. There were no soup kitchens. There were no clothing drives. There was no giant move to provide charity. Now, there were concerns about maintaining infrastructure and making sure we don't have societal collapse, but no direct individual care for another person as a unique person who needs care. Instead, all of a sudden, Christians in the Roman Empire are suddenly going to care for those that society says have no worth. The infants abandoned in the countryside, those who've caught the plague and are dying, orphans who are left to die, the beggars, those who are infirm, those who have contracted deadly diseases with no hope of being cured, things like leprosy that might spread by touch. Christians are going to rush into those areas with those people, and they're going to seek to minister to them. Well, this is going to give rise to a whole new shift in direction for the Western world. It is directly traceable to Christianity and this particular emphasis of the Christian ethic. Because Christians are not going to leave that person to simply die because he's gotten sick. Let me show you why. Turn over a couple chapters in the Gospel of Matthew to chapter 25. Look at verses 31 through 46. In the previous passage, Jesus gave us a pretty clear principle, but in this passage, he's going to give us a very clear, a much more clear picture of what this actually looks like. And he does it in the context of what happens at the end of all time. Here's what the Gospel of Matthew records for us. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, just as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or without clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will answer them, "I assure you, whatever you did for one of the least of these my brothers, you did for me." Then he will say to those on the left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not take me in. I was naked, and you did not clothe me, sick and in prison, and you did not take care of me." Then they too will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or without clothes, or sick, or in prison and not help you?" Then he will answer them, "I assure you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me either." And they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. This is a chilling passage in a lot of ways, because it's one of the places in the New Testament that can be the most convicting to encounter. Because here Jesus he compares all human beings at the end of time to a group of animals. In first century Judea, sheep and goats looked a lot like each other. The people who worked with them day in and day out, the shepherds and goat herds, they could tell them apart. But just by looking at them, you really couldn't tell which one's a sheep or a goat, just by surveying the thousands of animals all eating out on a meadow. Well, Jesus then says he's going to separate them into two groups. Now you'll notice this first group that gets to go to the kingdom of heaven, they're the ones that took care of people who had physical needs. And Jesus then draws a direct connection. He says, when you take care of one of these ill, naked, imprisoned, or sick, or dying, or poor human beings, you take care of me. This is a direct implication of Jesus being completely human. Because Jesus is completely human, all human beings are then identified with him. So to take care of a sick, homeless person is to take care of Jesus. Now, simultaneously, to ignore the sick, homeless person is to ignore Jesus. The first 3 centuries of Christianity are marked by a profound, profound compassion that had never before been seen in the world. Now, this is one of the main places where the Christian ethic shines forth as this high moral ground. Now, and it gives rise to what today is an international charity movement. Many of which organizations do not trace themselves back to Christianity today. But the very industry of charity, the massive systems we have in place today to take care of the poor and the downtrodden, and the infirm and the sick and the elderly, many of those trace directly back to this impetus in Christianity. I'm going to take a quick break with this video for the moment, and we'll finish this up in part 2. So go ahead and take a look. If you are done with this for now, please feel free to take a break, come back to part 2 later or tomorrow. Thank you very much.